The train screeched to a halt, metal screaming against metal, and for a long second Nikolai did not move. He sat by the window, staring at the dirty platform outside, afraid that if he stood up too fast, the moment would vanish like a dream. 10 years. 10 years of war, captivity, hunger, darkness, and counting days by scratches on stone walls. And now, home. He finally rose, lifted the faded army duffel onto his shoulder, and stepped into the vestibule. When he jumped down onto the platform, cold air hit his face like a slap. Nikolai stood still, scanning the station. He remembered this place differently. 10 years ago, an orchestra had played here. Mothers cried, girlfriends waved handkerchiefs, officers shouted orders. Back then, the station was clean, proud, alive. Now it looked sick. The plaster on the building had peeled away, exposing raw red brick. The columns were plastered with screaming advertisements, buy vouchers, money fast, remove curses. Loudspeakers blasted cheap music directly onto the street, clashing with the roar of engines and the angry shouts of people. Where flower beds once bloomed, rows of iron kiosks stood packed together like rotten teeth. Nikolai felt pressure build in his temples. He had grown used to silence, the heavy, suffocating silence of captivity. This chaos felt violent. He adjusted the collar of his old army coat. He was only 30, but his body felt ancient. Afghanistan had taken his youth. Prison had taken the rest. Hot desert winds, sand between his teeth, the constant fear of a bullet in the back. Then the pit, the darkness, the hunger, the long road home through borders where he officially no longer existed. He moved through the crowd. People instinctively stepped aside. Maybe it was his stare, cold, unblinking, the gaze of someone who had seen too much. Or maybe it was the scar running through his left eyebrow. Either way, no one met his eyes. The city was familiar and foreign at the same time. Broken asphalt crumbled underfoot, potholes filled with muddy water and bricks. Tinted foreign cars and battered old sedans rushed past, splashing pedestrians with filth. No one protested. People wiped their coats and walked on, heads lowered. Fear hung in the air like fog. When Nikolai turned onto Lenin Street, it grew quieter. The trees he remembered as saplings had grown tall, their bare winter branches clawing at the gray sky. His building stood at the end of the block, a plain 5-story apartment building, identical to thousands across the country. His heart began to pound. For years, lying on a dirt floor in a cell, he had imagined this moment, climbing the stairs, ringing the bell. His father, Ivan Stepanovich, opening the door, adjusting his glasses in disbelief before breaking into a smile. His mother, Antonina Petrovna, rushing from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron, crying with joy. Those images had kept him alive. The entrance door was new, metal, but the code lock had been ripped out, wires sticking from a jagged hole. Inside, the stairwell was dark. The bulbs were broken or stolen. It smelled of dampness, cats, and cheap tobacco. Nikolai climbed slowly, his hand brushing the railing. Every step was burned into his memory. On the second floor, he remembered sneaking cigarettes with friends before the army. Now the walls were covered in obscene graffiti and band names. Third floor, apartment 42. His breath caught. The old blue door with padded leather and shiny nails was gone. In its place stood a heavy steel door, painted gray, cold, alien, like a tank hatch. For a moment, doubt crept in. Had he made a mistake? No. Apartment 41 on the left, 43 on the right. He pressed the bell ring. The sound was sharp, unpleasant. Silence. He pressed it again, longer. Heavy footsteps approached, locks clicked, then another. The door swung open. It was not his father.
A massive man filled the doorway, bald, red-faced, wearing a stretched-out tank top and track pants. A thick gold chain hung around his neck, a toothpick rolled between his teeth. Behind him came the smell of fried onions and the loud laughter of the television. "What do you want?" the man growled. Nikolai felt the world tilt. "The Petrovs live here," he said hoarsely. The man laughed. "Get lost. This is my parents' apartment, Ivan and Antonina. Where are they?" The brute smirked, eyes crawling over Nikolai's worn clothes and army dag. "Listen, bum, this apartment belongs to a respected man, bought fair and square. Now get out before I throw you down the stairs." The shove came hard. Nikolai staggered but stayed on his feet. Instinct screamed, strike, break, kill, but he forced his fist to unclench. "Touch me again," he said quietly, "and I'll break your arm." The door slammed shut. Nikolai stood alone in the darkness, blood pounding in his ears. The war had not ended. It had just begun.
Nikolai stood in the dark stairwell long after the steel door slammed shut. The sound echoed through the podest like a gunshot. Somewhere above, someone laughed. Somewhere below, a door creaked open and closed. Life continued, just not his. His hands were shaking, not from fear, from restraint. 10 years ago, that shove would have ended differently. In Afghanistan, hesitation meant death. In captivity, weakness meant pain. His body still remembered how easily bones broke, how quickly breathing stopped. It took everything he had not to kick the door in and finish it right there. But violence without answers was useless. He turned to the neighboring door, apartment 41. This was where Aunt Valya lived, his mother's friend since school, a woman who knew every secret of the building, every family, every lie. If anyone knew what happened, it was her. He knocked. Once. Twice. No answer. He knocked again, harder. The sound rang hollow through the thin wood. At last, a faint noise came from inside, a shuffle, a breath held too long. "Who is it?" a frightened voice whispered. "Aunt Valya," Nikolai said gently. "It's me, Kolya Petrov." Silence. Then, trembling, "Go away. Kolya is dead. I'll call the police." Something cracked inside his chest. "Aunt Valya, please," he said. "Do you remember how I used to bring you apples on my bike, how you put iodine on my knee when I fell from the garages?" The lock rattled. A chain slid into place. The door opened a few centimeters. One eye appeared in the gap, old, watery, terrified. She stared at him for a long time. "My God," she whispered, "the eyes and the scar." The chain came off. The door opened fully. Aunt Valya began to cry immediately, silent tears, one hand covering her mouth. She pulled him inside quickly, as if afraid someone might see him and drag him away. Her apartment hadn't changed, and yet it had. The same carpet on the wall, the same ticking clock in the kitchen, the same smell of valerian and old books. But poverty had settled in like dust. The wallpaper was faded, the furniture sagged with age. A battered sewing machine stood under the window, Podolskaya, the kind everyone used to bring their clothes to. She fussed around him, setting the kettle, dropping spoons, touching his shoulders as if checking whether he was real.
"You're alive," she kept whispering. "They said you were dead." "Who said?" Nikolai asked. "The papers, the officials, they came years ago, said you were missing, then later dead." His stomach tightened. "And my parents." Aunt Valya sat down heavily. Her hands trembled. "They waited," she said quietly. "Your father wrote everywhere, to ministries, to generals. He stood in lines for days. They told him, forget, said you were gone." She swallowed. "Your mother, she didn't survive that." Nikolai felt the room tilt. "Heart," Aunt Valya said. "One night, just like that." He stared at the floor. His mind refused to accept it. In the pit, in the darkness, he had survived for them. Every beating, every hunger pain, for them. And my father, he asked, and Valya hesitated. He tried to fight when they started taking the apartments. New times, new laws, bandits with documents. They said the building was being redistributed. Nikolai's jaw tightened. He went to court, to the police. Then, one evening, he didn't come home. She crossed herself. They said robbery, case closed. Silence filled the kitchen. The kettle screamed on the stove, forgotten. And the apartment? And Valya laughed bitterly. Sold, cheap, through a fake power of attorney, while your father was still missing. Nikolai understood then. To the city, he was already buried. His parents were obstacles, and obstacles were removed. Who lives there now? He asked, though he already knew the answer. His name is Sergei Maloy, local authority. Don't touch him, Kolya. People disappear. Nikolai stood up. The soldier who had returned home finally died in that moment. In his place remained something colder. They took everything, he said quietly, because they thought I wouldn't come back. Aunt Valya grabbed his sleeve. Please, leave, go somewhere far away. Nikolai gently freed his arm. I already came back. Outside, the city breathed heavily, unaware that it had just made a fatal mistake.
Nikolai left Aunt Valya's apartment just before dawn. The stairwell was still dark, but his eyes no longer needed light. Something inside him had settled, cold, heavy, and calm. The kind of calm that comes only after a decision has already been made. Outside, the city was waking up. Engines coughed. Somewhere, a radio played. People hurried to work, pretending not to see the fear stitched into every wall and face. This city survived by forgetting, by looking away. Nikolai did not have that luxury. They had buried him while he was still alive, declared him dead, erased him, took his parents, took his home. In this city, the dead had no rights, no names, no protection. Fine. He walked for hours, memorizing streets, watching entrances, listening. Old habits returned easily. Afghanistan had taught him patience. Captivity had taught him endurance. The city taught him one final lesson. Power belonged to those who were willing to use it without mercy. By evening, he knew where Sergei Maloy drank, where his men gathered, where they felt safe. Safe was a mistake. Nikolai rented a room on the edge of town. Cash, no questions. He washed, shaved, and changed. The man in the cracked mirror was unfamiliar. The softness of hope was gone. What remained was sharper, harder. That night, he returned to Lenin Street. The stairwell was quiet. Too quiet. Apartment 42 glowed with light and noise, music, laughter, the clink of glasses. People who believed tomorrow was guaranteed. The door opened after the first knock. It was the same brute from before. The smirk barely had time to form. Nikolai stepped inside. What happened next would never appear in police reports. No witnesses would remember clearly. In the morning, neighbors would speak in whispers, shrug, and say they heard nothing. By dawn, the apartment was silent. Nikolai stood alone in the living room that had once been his parents'. The wallpaper was different, the furniture, chuzhuya, but the walls remembered. He closed his eyes for a moment. "I'm home," he whispered. He did not stay. Men like him were not meant to settle. He left the city before sunrise, walking toward the road with the same old army bag on his shoulder. Behind him, the city would breathe easier, not knowing why. Somewhere, new criminals would rise, new lies would be written. But for the first time in 10 years, Nikolai felt something close to peace,
The war was over. Not because he had survived it, because he had finished it.